changes occurring at the local level and the state level, we see were still not enough to improve the plight of workers and those living in the slums during this period. Even greater change was needed at the national or federal level. And we will see this in a number of progressive presidents, the most progressive of them being Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, who assumed the presidency following the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. You'll hear a little bit about Roosevelt's personal background and earlier career in the next lecture about foreign affairs during this era. For now, let me focus on a few of his policies as president. And again, he is considered the most progressive of presidents. First of all, he is sometimes known as the trust buster, or he's nicknamed as the trust-busting president. You see a cartoon there on the right reflecting some of these antitrust views. After taking office, he aggressively pursued some of the laws that were already on the books regarding monopolies and trusts, as they were known during that period. Roosevelt thought it would be better for competition, it would be better for workers and for small businesses to break up many of these monopolies. Most celebrated of these attacks was his disruption of the Northern Securities Company, which was one of the major railroad holding companies during that period. And it was broken up into several smaller companies during that time. Roosevelt eventually realized, though, that breaking up of trusts and monopolies was a dicey matter. Just because a company is huge and dominant, does that mean that what it is doing is bad? Sometimes we see these enormous companies, because they operate on economies of scale and they can afford to hire thousands and thousands of experts in research and development. Sometimes it's enormous companies or monopolies that drive forward innovation and technology and change. And Teddy Roosevelt wrestled with these issues. He did pursue the trusts. He did break up some of the trusts. At the same time, though, he tried to ask himself whether this or that company was really better or worse as a monopoly. And so what we will see is that Teddy Roosevelt was not the most aggressive president in terms of attacking the trusts, even though he is nicknamed the trust buster. Roosevelt also was progressive in his approach toward labor. He was as great a champion of labor as we had had in the White House up to that point. In 1902, he created a new cabinet-level office, the Department of Labor and Commerce, to address some of the issues confronting labor and the working class during this time. And what we will see is Roosevelt takes a different approach to handling the labor issues of that era. You might remember when we talked about things like the Homestead strike and the Pullman strike in an earlier period of the 1890s. Well, Teddy Roosevelt, when confronted with similar issues during his presidency, took a different approach. One of the best examples of this was the anthracite coal strike in 1902. In that year, in the summer, a group of coal miners in Pennsylvania walked out on strike. Initially, it was not thought to be a great national matter, but by October, as a bit of a chill began to set in, and Teddy Roosevelt and others began to realize that winter is coming and we don't have any coal. And so it became a matter of national safety and security, and so the president got involved. Well, as we've seen in the past, the president called in representatives from both sides, but unlike previous examples, where it was always workers who were crushed and who were brought to discipline and returned to work with no benefits, Teddy Roosevelt threatened management in this case and coerced management to give the workers some of what they were demanding in terms of better pay and better conditions during this period. And so the workers go back to work with improved conditions. Now, this is not a great romance. Workers are not going to win every strike we see during this period, but they do have greater recognition than they had before, they have a greater voice, and they have a president who, at least in some cases, is going to support them. Teddy Roosevelt also took an active interest in the issue of pure food and drugs. And while it may be apocryphal or something of a myth, the story had it that Teddy Roosevelt in 1906 was eating his breakfast, sitting there eating his sausage, while reading Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. And he was horrified by what he read and immediately was moved to make changes and improvements in terms of pure food and drugs. Whether that exactly happened or not, we know that Roosevelt read The Jungle and that he was influenced by it. So if you think about purchasing products today, canned goods or any kind of packaged goods, they always come with labels and all kinds of ingredients and nutritional information is printed on them, dates and so on, so that we'll know the contents are healthy. If you observe the cartoon at the bottom of the page, the hilarious but in some ways mortifying cartoon, this was the state of things in the 1890s or early 1900s, before we have that sort of labeling. You would purchase your can of meat or tinned meat, and it could be just about anything in there. You see the creatures flying out of that can, including what looked to be rabbits, birds, squirrels, and who knows what else, from the ham and tongue tin. This is the sort of situation that Teddy Roosevelt and American consumers dealt with. In any case, there had been a movement to improve those conditions, but it came to a head in 1906 after The Jungle was published and spearheaded by Teddy Roosevelt. It culminated in the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which instituted labeling, among other things, and it was a beginning. You didn't have all the information that we see on our products now, but it had some of the information, and it had dates and things so people would know when the contents might be rotten. It also called for inspections of the producers. It called for inspections of factories so that people would know that the conditions under which their food was processed were sanitary. A final area in which Teddy Roosevelt represented the progressive thinking of the day was in thinking about the environment. Roosevelt was a great outdoorsman himself. From his time as a young child, there are stories of him as a child. He was an avid hunter, and he actually had a collection of squirrels under his bed as a child that he had shot and stuffed himself. Throughout his life, he was a great outdoorsman, took a tremendous interest in the environment. At the same time, he walked a line at that time that was very much a national issue between preserving the environment in its untouched, pristine quality or using the environment cautiously and carefully. And this comes to a head in the clash between what we can call conservation versus preservation. The preservationist view was best represented by a man named John Muir. You actually see him pictured in the photograph on the right next to Teddy Roosevelt. John Muir was a preservationist. He believed that the environment should be simply untouched and should be preserved in its original state. He was known to do things like wander off into the woods with nothing for months at a time, and then he would resurface months later, no worse the wear. He was simply one with the wilderness. Teddy Roosevelt adopted what we might describe as a conservationist stance. He realized that preservation is in some ways unreasonable. And so conservation advocates a careful use of the environment and preserving the environment when we can. Teddy Roosevelt set aside more acreage for national parks than any president up to that point. The issue we see is brought to a head in some ways by the loggers that you see pictured at the left. This is where the preservationist and conservationist first clashed, was in the logging industry, which was simply tearing up the countryside in Northern California, where the enormous redwood trees are to be found. And you see in some ways the tragic picture there at the left of this tree, many hundreds of years old, which has been fallen by the loggers. So Teddy Roosevelt does not adopt the preservationist view, but rather one of cautious and careful use of the environment in terms of conservation. The progressive policies of Teddy Roosevelt were extended and in some ways exceeded by President Woodrow Wilson, who was president from 1913 to 1921. He advocated an equally progressive legislative agenda to Teddy Roosevelt, and at times was able to enact change that Teddy Roosevelt had only considered during his presidency. Among the progressive policies that Wilson enacted were a lower tariff in 1913. This would help to lower cost of products all across the country. It would return purchasing power to the American people and on the whole help the economy, although big business interests were concerned that it would hurt their bottom line. Woodrow Wilson also installed the Federal Reserve System. He insisted that banking become a public interest rather than a private one. And again, this removed much of the decision-making power from secretive and at times corrupt banks and made them a federal interest. And finally, Woodrow Wilson pursued antitrust legislation as aggressively and perhaps more so than Teddy Roosevelt himself. Among the laws that Wilson advocated were greater regulation of businesses, all manner of laws, making it tougher for businesses to collude with each other and to fix prices and things of that nature. In another instance, Wilson raised wages and cut working hours for railroad workers under his presidency. And so the progressive era in some ways reaches its greatest heights during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. According to the history books, the progressive era comes to an end with the onset of World War I in the 19-teens. Historians very much debate whether the progressive era ever came to an absolute end or whether its interests were merely put aside for a time with the onset of the war. But whatever the case, the nation turned its attentions to this great international conflict, and on the home front, the American people saw that what had been an extension of their own powers and the extension of democracy was in some ways subsumed to the national effort. And we see once again the government becoming the dominant entity in American life. And yet we can look back on the progressive era as a whole and realize that it certainly changed the mindset of the American people from the social Darwinist way of thinking to the reform Darwinist way of thinking. The American people never really go back to a people that does not view the government as an agency that should help the American people, although they debate the extent to which the government should provide aid. But for whatever good it did, the progressive era certainly had its shortcomings. All of the laws and rules that are implemented during this time failed to impact each and every American or immigrant suffering at the lower end of the economic scale. There remained great issues in the workplace, in the urban slums, and elsewhere in American life. It also did not change things equally for women and for minorities during this time. We will address these kind of issues in lectures moving forward. But the Progressive Era was not the brightest moment in our history for African Americans in particular, nor for the progression of women's rights, although we will talk about those advances in future lectures. Nonetheless, the Progressive Era was an important time in improving the lives of those at the bottom of the economic scale.